Um, One question I have about in terms of moving forward into the future that I'm concerned about. You painted the image earlier of Mark Zuckerberg there without the VR headset and everybody around him with the VR headset. I mean, they're making a big move into the metaverse. Everything I've seen there has been fairly dystopian. There are investors who are snapping up like $1 million properties on fake Rodeo Drive or
Oh,
whatever. I
Oh,
mean, what are your thoughts and opinions on the metaverse and how this could go wrong for us?
I interviewed this guy called Jaron Lanier, who's a kind of legend in Silicon Valley, a brilliant tech designer and a really outspoken dissident. And he used to advise movies like Minority Report, dystopian movies, so he would design like technologies for a future dystopia. And he said to me, he stopped doing it because he kept designing these horrific technologies, and then loads of other tech designers would see it and go, "Hey, that's really cool. Let's make that." And he was
my
like, "No,
God.
that's not
Wow.
what I meant." Literally, it's like, I can't ethically carry on doing it. I'm contributing to creating the dystopias that I meant to warn against. I mean, the metaverse is so obviously horrific that I feel like, in a sense, all you need to do is explain to people what it is, this idea that we would be all interacting in a virtual world. It reminds me, it comes back to right what you asked at the start, though, Kyle, about how this interacts with a society where we don't want to be present because we're so stressed and we're so unhappy. I went to this internet rehab center, the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's just outside Spokane in Washington. And they get all kinds of people there, but they disproportionately get young men who've become obsessed with online multiplayer role player games and pornography. And it was so interesting talking to these guys, and then later talking to Dr. Hilary Cash, who runs this center, incredibly wise woman. And I remember her saying to me, "You've got to ask yourself, what do these young men get out of these games? Because they get something out of it, right? And what they get is often a sense they're good at something. We've created a society that does not make people feel they're good at anything, particularly young men. They get a sense that they're physically roaming around. The figures on this are incredible. By 2003, only 10% of American children ever played outside without adult supervision. They get a sense that they're being seen by other people. This is a profoundly lonely society. 41% of Americans before the epidemic agreed with the statement, "No one knows me well." But what they're getting is a kind of parody of those things, right? And it was interesting talking to them because a lot of them have been obsessed with porn. And it was so interesting because I realized, in a way, the relationship between social media and social life, I think, is a bit like the relationship between porn and sex. I'm not anti-porn. Porn will meet a certain basic itch. But if your entire sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be going around kind of pissed off and grouchy all day because we didn't evolve to masturbate over screens. We evolved to actually have sex, right? And in a similar way, we did not evolve to interact through screens. But if you have a society that is deeply disconnected, that is where people have been filled with values that are profoundly wrong, that lead them towards unhappiness, where they're acutely lonely. In a sense, with the metaverse, I think you've got to ask two things. Firstly, how do we stop this horrific technological giant from increasingly invasive technology? But also, how the fuck did we create a culture where anyone would want to be in the metaverse? It reminds me of, as you know, I wrote a book about addiction called Chasing the Screen that's just been made into an 8-part series with Samuel L. Jackson, which people can watch on Roku. It's called The Fix. Sorry, they told me to plug that. And I think a lot about, the evidence. Where is the opioid crisis happening? It's not actually happening in the places where it's easiest to get hold of opioids. Every single person on the faculty of Harvard has great medical insurance. Their doctors trust them. They could all go and get opioids tomorrow. And very few of them do. It's happening in places like somewhere I went, Monadnock, New Hampshire, where what happened in Monadnock, New Hampshire? People were stripped of the things that made life worth living. When a factory shuts down in a town, the rate of opioid overdoses doubles over the next 5 years, right? No one finds that difficult to understand. This is why Professor Ann Case and Professor Angus Dayton, who've done the best research on the opioid crisis, call them deaths of despair. There's been an enormous increase in deaths of despair, suicide, opioid deaths across the board. And they're all happening in the same place, which I think helps you to understand. They're also, by the way, the places that voted most for Trump, which I don't mean as a cheap point. They are, that too was a form of despair, a catastrophic one. And in part, there are many things going on. And in a way, it feels to me like the metaverse is a death of despair. A society that will want to choose the metaverse will be a society that is despairing for the same reasons. It to some degree. I wouldn't want to overstate it, as the things that are driving the opioid crisis and so on. We've created a culture where people don't want to be present. Yeah. And they're not wrong. We've deprived people of very basic psychological needs. Everyone knows they have physical needs. You need food, you need water, you need shelter. But human beings just as much have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel you have meaningful work. You need to feel you have a future that makes sense. And this culture we built deprives most of the population of at least one of those needs.
And I think the saddest part of all of it is that, so now you have like the metaverse being created, and you and I talked about this recently. What people are going to find is the same commercial interests that sort of destroyed normal life will either destroy the metaverse or already are destroying the metaverse.
Oh, well, so they have complete control in the metaverse.
Well, you're going to need escapism from the escapism in order to find them. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just a never-ending vicious cycle. So the metaverse is going to be all about NFT scams and porn, and you're going to need an escape from the escape. But my final question for you, because we're running out of time here, but it's actually as it pertains to your previous book. So now I'm somebody who, in my personal experience and messing around with substances, I found that particularly at a low point in my life, it actually succeeded in giving me what I needed in order to continue to get through the hard times, to then eventually dig it out of the dirt and grind and get back to some decent times. And what I find now that, times are decent, still every now and then, enjoying partaking in substances. So, do you think, in a similar way to what you just said about pornography before, that like, yeah, look, I'm not anti-porn, but you also want to have sex too. Do you feel the same way about substances when it comes to addiction, or is it more of a, hey, maybe abstinence is a better thing when it comes to the substances, and we should not rely on them as a crutch in any way, shape, or form?
Oh no, you've got to separate out two things.